team that helped work here. I realize that's, you guys. I wish it was you guys. They did a good job. Okay, so what can we learn down there? What's going on in those little structures? Well, they burn too. And this was really surprising. They burned too. And now we're thinking, well, one caveat though, did it burn at the same time? We have no tree rings from this structure called Choya House. We don't know, but there was wood there. I should make this a little clearer. See, this is a burned piece of roof beam here. These guys were stuck in the sidewall, so we didn't get them out of there. We should have, because we didn't know the wood we got didn't date. So we don't know if it burned at exactly the same time, but we think it probably did. So now the headquarters burns, and the small structures burned, which suggests to us that somebody worked really hard to make this happen. And we'll get to that in a couple minutes. All right, fine. I'm watching the time here, so I'll keep on track. How about other places that archaeologists have dug up out there? All those dots on those maps, big regional scale. Do we know anything about them? We go back into the museums. What did the contemporaries do? And look at old collections and old notes. So back to this map. So look at some of these dots out here. Here's one I'm going to show you in a minute. Manzanares. A couple of other ones. Another one I'm going to show you is Arroyo Hondo. That's for a set while we're still tracking. Arroyo Hondo is a pueblo that was dug up in the 70s, exactly the same dates, maybe a little later than burnt corn. There was burning at Arroyo Hondo, but at a scale that looked accidental. You find a burned room in a structure. And they excavated lots of this structure. So their interpretation was, yeah, sometimes in the winter when you're trying to stay warm, someone actually, the corn catches on fire, something happens. Accidents happen. But when accidents happen, they seal it up and let the fire burn out and it's done. So what this tells us is that burnt corn doesn't look like an accident. Because we can see accidents at Arroyo Hondo, or at least we can interpret them that way. That's telling us something. There's a place called Manzanares, another village down the road from burnt corn, pretty close, one of the neighbors. Manzanares, same dates, same time, burned. More digging. We're getting close to the end of this, right? We're running out of money. We're spending government's money, spending taxpayers' money on this, getting close to the end of this. Okay, let's do some more digging ourselves. And we had an opportunity that came up to go and do a little excavation on another site nearby, about 8 kilometers away. So, burnt corn is right at the bottom of that hill back there. 8 kilometers away, Lodestar, bunch of little farmsteads out here, contemporary, burned. None of this did we expect. All right. Last bit of input here before we start to bring it all together. During the same time period, I had some colleagues at the University of Arizona who were really interested in doing some experiments on how hard it might be to burn a pueblo. So they built one and burned it down. What you've got there is it's an experiment. Archaeologists sometimes do this. We say, okay, how does this work? We use the same kind of technology, at least as we can mimic it. We build some mud brick, we build some stone foundations, build some wood ceilings, and light it on fire. Lesson here, it is not easy to burn a mud building. Okay, not easy at all. They had to work really hard to burn their model down here. And that tells me that burnt corn, it took work to burn the whole village. It's not like from the cowboy movies, if anybody ever watched them anymore, you ride by and throw a torch to the window and everything burns down, and it doesn't work that way. They had arson investigators out here, and it was really, really good to talk to them, and they had a lot to say about these kinds of things. 7 different data points. What happened? What happened at burnt corn, or where do we go with this information? All right, so I'm going to do that, and let me take questions as well. We'll open up the floor and tackle this in some other kinds of ways. Our inclination when we went into this was to imagine that conflict was a result of competition over resources in a scarce landscape. Or if you want to be more precise, a landscape of scarcity, right? Places where if you have a bad year, a bad corn crop, you're going to be in trouble. You need good land, you need water, you need all these things in this kind of environment, and you don't have it, you may be fighting your neighbors for it. These are the neighbors. This is a big community called Pueblo San Marcos, about 5 kilometers from Burnt Corn. Pueblo San Marcos had 3,000 rooms in it when the Spanish arrived, when Coronado arrived in 1539. It's a big village. San Marcos was probably occupied contemporaneously with Burnt Corn, and they made it, and the Burnt Corn people didn't. So our argument was, okay, what we're looking at here is competition over resources in the landscape. Some people get it, some people don't. Those little triangles, over that map, do that name or not, yeah. These little, San Marcos is way up here someplace. We think that these little camps out here were people from San Marcos coming out and using those local resources. They're the nearest village during the time period when these artifacts were left. Resource competition, that's our traditional model anyway. People are fighting over food in one or land. They're migrating in, they're migrating out. It's unstable, trying to establish a pattern there. All right, looks good, burn it down. They have a conflict between villages, very, very local, very, very resource-oriented. Yeah, but we have a lot of ethnography about Pueblos. We talked about the 1930s era stuff. There's a lot, the Pueblo literature has a lot to say about conflict. And they don't tend to pitch it as a resource issue. They tend to pitch it in a variety of different culturally bound ways. When something is going wrong in traditional Pueblo society, it's because people are morally corrupt. In other words, if you're having a bad year or a bad harvest, it's not because the rains didn't come, it's because somebody in your community is bad. And that's why the rains didn't arrive, and somebody in your community was a witch. And witches are killed. And that's the way to resolve the problem. In other words, a success or failure of a community is sort of a moral issue in many ways, as much as it is an economic or a subsistence issue. So we have a lot of evidence right now. This is an image from the 19th century Pueblo context of Cushing, an early anthropologist, called this torturing a sorcerer. The idea is that this is a Pueblo, an ethnographic community where something bad was going on, and they identified someone as a witch, and we're treating them as you treated witches. Of course, I'm not saying that witchcraft actually was real, and there actually were witches. I'm saying there's a cultural belief that witchcraft existed, and there are examples of villages being abandoned because of witchcraft. So in this case, I use the term decommissioning here. The idea is that maybe they shut it down themselves. Maybe it's a ritual process. Maybe things were going bad at Burnt Corn. Maybe things were going in a direction that they could not, they were arguing, they were fighting, they had bad crops, who knows what it was. But it was so bad that the village elders had said, okay, we gotta go. We have to burn this village down because bad things are happening here. Which would have been a serious, it's also burning food, but they're burning next year's meals, right, in the corn, so we have to be pretty bad if we're going there. Fine, but what about the neighbors? What about Manzanares? What about those other kind of things? Because you go over to some of the other ones that looks like they got sacked. I mean, there are broken pots on the floors and things. And at this point, we went back to conflict archaeology. And here, this is just an image. I was at Remembrance Day in London on the 11th of November last year. And this is a picture I took then commemorating World War I. One thing that conflict archaeology tells us, and it should be no surprise, is that conflict is complicated. It's complicated. We would like to say, oh, it's A or B, right? We'd like to say, okay, they're fighting for resources, or it's all about witchcraft, or it's enemies came in and raided, but maybe it's all of those things happening at the same time. Because, of course, that's what war is like. And if we think about, our own knowledge of historic wars, contemporary wars, lots goes on in conflicts. It's not necessarily obvious or predictable or standard. Archaeologists would like to reduce it to a kind of meaningful, a not simple answer, but one cohesive answer. Maybe that cohesive answer is, this is a very complicated historical process that went on for a generation. Maybe it was a war. Maybe it's not warfare or ritual, it was a war. A historically bounded series of events that involved all these things. Small communities getting sacked, maybe some communities get decommissioned because of cultural concepts, maybe all kinds of things are possible, but you know what? At the end of it, it's over. It's over. Nobody ever burns down San Marcos. San Marcos is there for 200, 300 years after this all happens. It's all fine, but whatever happens here at the beginning of this process doesn't repeat itself. And that suggests to me, this argument that I make, that we're looking at history here. We're looking at war as we understand it in its complex ways, not as anthropologists and archaeologists would like to sort of boil it down to a few overriding variables. A couple of final thoughts, and then we're going to open up the floor for discussion here. There's lots of other data under the ground in burnt corns. There's plenty of ways this could be another sample of a room of excavation here, could change this whole interpretation. And that's the rub of archaeology. We don't dig everything up. We want to leave things for other people later on, or we leave it to preserve it. Maybe we want anyway to dig it up. It's a finite resource. But by saying that, we're also saying that you walk away and say, we've got X, Y, Z, you've got 7 points here. We could spend a couple hours down there, another year and find something totally different that would change all of this stuff. But the Burnt Corn Project does suggest the value at drawing all these threads together and not relying on one thing, not digging in one place, not surveying just one thing, but try to build these cohesive research projects where we're looking at all sorts of variables and being amazed, frankly, at how they pan out. I want to leave you with this quotation, which is from an ethnographic account of the destruction of a village at one of the communities at Hopi in Arizona. And this is a case where the leader of the village was away for a period of time, came back, and found that in his absence, his neighbors had fallen into bad ways. They were gambling, they were having affairs with other people's spouses, they were blaspheming, they'd gone bad, shall we say. And at that point, the leader's duty was to destroy them. So he says, he performs the necessary process and says, at this moment, the firestorm surged over the horizon. This is how the village leader, Pivan Hokyapi, purged the dark hearts of his people. Thanks very much. Happy to take questions. We have a mic here that we can bring up to you, pass it around. There's lots of angles to pursue, so let's dig in.
Yeah, what you're looking at here seems to be the old tale of the blind man trying to describe an elephant. You can't really see the picture by looking in a hole. And what you've done is you have found clues and you have found areas. And I know that part of New Mexico where there are people, the Anasazi, where did they go? Did they go to the Pueblos? Who went where? You're at the boundaries of the Plains Indian culture. So are they coming in? So your task is monumental.
Well, that's a great metaphor for archaeology, right? And one thing that we're taught if we do this is that you kind of pick the things that you think you can look at in your own kind of way, and you presume that someone's going to come along and prove you wrong if they ever have a chance. Because you're exactly right. We're looking at these little tiny slices of things. I talk to my students. I say, we're sitting in the classroom. I say, okay, suppose we did an excavation in this room. We'll learn something about you guys. I mean, the average classroom is bigger than most excavations I've ever been participating in, right? Because it's expensive, right? It takes time. So what is this going to tell us about your life? Right? You're here. We dig you up right here. But this just tells you a little tiny bit about one little part of your life. So yes. But that's I don't know. That's kind of fun. We'd like to know, but we know that our angles are limited, so we kind of roll the dice and see what we can come up with. As far as the sort of Asazi and the plains here, the modern Pueblo people are the descendants of those folks that archaeologists used to call Asazi. And they'll tell you that. And there's in the modern parlance, there's no debate about that. I mean, their historical traditions go back to the famous places like Chocolate Canyon, Mesa Verde, these kinds of things. And they're always irked at us for even using that word, Asazi. But it's a common framework that we use, right? Plains people did come to this part of the Southwest. As you say, it's right on the edge. But we don't see them at this early stage. We see them a little bit later, and it's an interesting question as to why not. The actual boundaries of the Pueblo world in, say, 1300 or so were probably another 100 kilometers farther to the east. And out there, which is actually getting on the real edge of the plains, if you're looking out towards Texas that way. Out there, you do see them sometimes. Later, there's evidence for Comanches, horse culture people coming later that you find them here. After the Spanish bringing the horse, that changes things. Before that, here, for some reason, no, even though I think we would expect to see them. Other questions? Sure.
I want to know what it is you meant by the Galisteo War. Like, was it a conflict between the burnt corn and maybe another village? Was it like over resources, or what does that involve?
Well, it could have been over a lot of things, and that's one of the challenges that we face. I mean, my use of that definition is, as opposed to some of the others, is to say that there may have been many other variables involved. Maybe they were competing for food. Here's the thing about food. The burning the corn is striking. It really is striking. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, that's next year's food supply that you just put to the torch. And it's good for anybody. I mean, if someone's attacking you, why are they burning the food that they could take themselves? If you're burning your own place down, wow, how bad would that have to be to burn? And you would then be moving on someplace else to a very uncertain, hungry future. So it had to be really bad to have done that. And I made this point in a lecture not too long ago, and a friend of mine who was in the audience said, so what about stored corn? He said, that corn on the roof isn't any good right now. It's good later. It'll be good when it's all dry. Can't eat it now. If you had to leave in a hurry, for whatever reason, you wouldn't take that stuff. You would take the dry corn that was already stored with you. And we went back and looked at some of our stuff and realized that one of our rooms that we excavated looked a whole lot like a cleared out storage room. It looked like, there's a little corn pile on the floor, a few little corn cobs around. It's the kind of signature you expect from people that loaded up their baskets and took it. And then there was a whole different picture there, right? You think, okay, where did they go? Right? Did they fighting the next village, or could they go to the village? Or those things are almost impossible to define. And that, I guess if you think about it in an archaeological data sense, what could we see? Suppose you guys got attacked by by people from Pismo Beach. All right? Suppose they launched a raid on us tonight, and whatever reason, burned this place down, everybody left. Archaeologists come along, 500 years. What would they find in the evidence there that would let them say, ah, Pismo Beach? Right? I don't know. And that's the challenge, right? What you're pointing out there is that's exactly it. How do we know that these were the next village or the one beyond that or someone from far outside? We don't think far outside because the farther you go, the more likely it is that you have different kinds of artifacts that you could see, but we don't see any of that. We look for like weapons, like arrowheads and things, but the arrowheads that we would find our guys using look like the ones that the guys next door use. They're not that different. You follow me here? This is the question that you ask, exactly the kind of questions that we're asking. The idea of the Galisteo War is simply that during a particular time period, all hell broke loose for these guys in this place. And when it was over, it was over. We know sort of when it started, we know sort of when it ended, and we know that it was complicated. And these are just some scenarios that play out. Does that make sense? Does that help with that? Yeah.
You mentioned that there were no human remains found at Burnt Corn. Were there human remains found at any of the other places you excavated, or weapons at all?
Well, the human remains, no. There are places in the region where we do find human remains in ways that suggest some kind of conflict, but not in the same way that I introduced at the beginning of my talk about that cowboy wash scenario. We don't see anything like that. And that's also another interesting point, because we tend to say, conflict and think of it as one thing. When they were killing and eating each other up there in southwestern Colorado, I don't know what that was, but that was really awful and really different. In northern New Mexico, in places that burn, we don't tend to find human remains. But I would also refer you back to my sampling problem. Suppose that there were a whole bunch of bodies in the next room that we didn't dig up, I don't think so. There weren't, because of course these little prairie dogs are digging stuff up all over the place. I think if there were lots of human remains in that site, we would have found, a few scattered bones around here and didn't find anything like that. The only evidence that we found that there were human remains there were probably from burials. So that floor I showed you, that floor had been patched in ways that made us think that there were probably burials down under that floor. But we're not excavating burials right now, so we left it alone. But in any event, that would have happened before the attacks. They wouldn't come back in afterwards to bury someone. So it would have been, back when things were better. So yeah, the human remains thing is a big question, but we don't see. And that suggests a certain kind of pattern. Whether it holds up under further research, I don't know. Answer your question? Did I get all parts of it? Yeah, sure. Other questions? So one thing that I should point out that I forgot to mention, as we're going to I'll get back to, is that people often say, was it a forest fire? Right? Was it a forest fire? Of course, that's pertinent for us right now, right? Pertinent for us right now. But it seemed, but two things suggest to us that it wasn't. One is that this kind of woodland, which ethnobotanical evidence suggests typified the landscape then and now, doesn't burn in that same way. I mean, it's too dispersed, it doesn't burn in that kind of catastrophic way that I'm getting around here right now. But also, if people were living there, and they're stepping on, trampling things, they're cutting down trees, they're pounding grass in the dirt, that Pueblo, when people were living there, would have been a dust bowl all around it. I mean, there would have been no fuel for that kind of thing. So we rule out accident, although, that accident and, like, natural causes. Yes, one question.
So I guess you sort of preempted my question a little bit, but
no, sorry.
That's fine.
Psychically, I knew that was out there
that's
somewhere.
right, it was coming, yeah, you can sense it. So I guess my question is maybe more broad. Like, what was the underpinnings of the climate at the time? I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Jared Diamond's work, and he sort of suggested a lot of the abandonment of the Southwest was maybe climate induced, and there were these broader changes. But it sounds like you know the timeline pretty well.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's important to cover some of that. So and this was a question that you mentioned about Anasazi's and abandonment things. One of the major narratives that we have focused on about people in, Pueblo people in the American Southwest, and that there are these large settled areas of the region, particularly in what they call the Four Corners in New Mexico, and Utah, and Colorado, and Arizona meet, which centuries earlier were heavily populated. That's where Mesa Verde is, that's where Chocolate Canyon is. And then all of a sudden, it's all over there. Everybody leaves, it's over. Now, some of that nowadays, we are linking to some of this conflict, not this example, but other examples. So by about 1260, 1270, all those areas are now empty. You know that the dates for burnt corn occur right after that. Pueblo's settlement in this part of New Mexico is connected in some way to the abandonment of the other parts of the Southwest. And actually how that works is a little tricky, but what we do have is a huge population surge. So and this gets back to your thing about maybe fighting over resources and things, because all of a sudden, about 1275, 1280, 1290, lots of new villages pop up in this landscape. Lots of them. And one of our interpretations is this is evidence, maybe not directly linked, like not in a line, but this is evidence for new people coming in from 100, 200 miles away and setting up new villages. And that's in fact what they would say, right? The Pueblo people today say, yeah, we came from over there, you know, things were going bad over there, we left. It's connected to climate, but here's the thing that I find tricky about that. So there were some really spectacular droughts in the middle 1200s, and the argument, one of the famous old things called the Great Drought. Spectacular droughts in the middle 1200s, which, you know, after that, people weren't living there anymore and they moved out. And that makes sense to us, I would say. Us meaning people like me, who come from a place in Heritage where there was lots of rain and lots of wheat, wet environments. Major droughts would have been a catastrophe for my ancestors in Missouri. Pueblo people lived in a landscape where droughts happened all the time at various scales. They had lived in that particular part of the Southwest for 1,000 years, up and down, good years and bad years. I don't see any reason why that particular great drought would have been so unbelievably catastrophic as to lead them to abandon their homeland permanently forever. This is me speaking here, right? And this is an argument people make. And yet they did. So my hunch, and again, this is based upon the fact that people who grow crops in a dry climate know how to do it. They have time-honored strategies for moving, for changing, for shifting. This is what they did. But in this case, they did something radically different. And I think it was conflict. I think something happened over there, something in the politics of it that meant that this drought, that time, that place, was a very different kind of catastrophe than they were used to having. But they get over to the Rio Grande, new, weather's better, different landscape, new villages. But maybe there was kind of a land rush, right? Maybe there's a kind of time where people were jockeying for access to new lands, and that's may have been one of the triggers for this conflict. Just because it does coincide fairly neatly with that migration. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I know they said like the date of like October 30th, so because of that, do you think that like burnt corn was burned down all in one day instead? Because if it was like a war or like conflict, could like some of the structures have been burned down on separate days, like we've been multiple raids?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, so as I pointed out earlier, it was a lot of work to burn this town. So you would have to scratch the idea that people came over the ridge, killed everybody, ran them all off, and then ran back home, right, having defeated the enemy, because it would have taken days. Days to burn this. So, I mean, they would have been, because the corn's on the roof, right? You burn the corn on the roof, but the corn is sitting on top of mud on the roof, which is over the wooden beams. So how does the fire get from the corn to the beams? Do you have to burn the corn and the beams from the inside? That's a lot of work. A lot of work, took a lot of time. And people have done simulations of how you burn a Pueblo, you know, and even if you're burning it, fire doesn't travel through it very well, but a lot of ignition points in there. I don't know, it seems to be the case. So archaeology can't tell us if it happened in a day, or in 3, or in 5, or in weeks. What it seems to suggest is that it was done systematically. Now, let me show you. Let me show you this map here. Because there's an interesting, or at least I think it's interesting, angle to take on that issue that we can see here. So this is that second period map. So you've got this, I call this like a donut hole, right? You've got a hole in the middle and this ring of stuff around the outside. This, at this time period, this wouldn't have been like we see today, little low mounds of, this would have been standing, scorched ruins during this time period. All right? And so what I envision is, families coming out here to harvest piñons, to hunt, to do things. And people are out there with grandma, and grandma says, hey, look over there. Look across at those burned ruins. Look at that place. And again, I'm not saying whether it was destroyed, quickly or slowly, but it was destroyed. Grandma's saying that there were bad people there, and that's what happens to bad people. In other words, just the ruins, however the time frame is for its actual destruction, were a kind of a landmark in this local community for that reflected cultural lessons. But as to the specifics of your question, I'm not sure where we go there. But it's good to think through, right? Good to think through. What kind of pattern of evidence would we imagine to make that happen? And that one would stump me. But if you've got some ideas, I'd love to talk it over because it's intriguing. Other questions?
I'm a little curious about the wood that was used in those buildings, because I've been to just kind of like these areas, and I've never seen the juniper bushes, trees get very large at all.
Well, yeah, I'll take that. That's an excellent question on multiple levels. I mean, I've been working with a friend of mine in Santa Fe who's been going out on everything is interesting to archaeologists, right? We never turn our brains off. So he was taking hikes up in the hills around Santa Fe, and he was looking, as you say, looking at juniper trees, looking at piñon trees, and thinking, okay, so how old are these trees? And what does it say about, because of course, before, quite recently, they were firewood, construction wood and firewood. And you had a historic town there, and truckloads of wagon loads of wood harvested from around there. So those juniper trees that you and I see in that landscape are not very old. Right? And if you look at old pictures of a place like Santa Fe, there's no trees in the hills around it. They're all cut down. So what we can imagine is that there would have been bigger standing trees, bigger standing groves that were more appropriate for construction wood than they are now. But of course, they cut those down. So then the question is, did they ever have a scarcity of lumber? And we do see sometimes evidence that people are looting old wood from abandoned villages. So let me throw this out. I'm glad you mentioned this because all of the wood that we dated at burnt corn was small. And they're what we call, the Spanish are latillas. They're secondary. So you've got beams in your structure, big beams, which you call vigas in Spanish, big beams that stick around, the bigger trees, and then lots of sort of smaller branches, which are secondaries to like hold up the dirt to build that. We found no vigas in these buildings. And one of the things people have we've been talking about is maybe it got scavenged. Maybe, in fact, those neighbors came back in after a while and took the bigger roof beams and used them to build their houses. Just because they're not there now. They're gone. And they didn't burn up to a crisp. I mean, they would have been, some of them left there. And you didn't see any. And that would get back to the question about wood and procurement. Maybe eventually people started having to scavenge wood because the bigger beams that used to be there when they first moved in were gone because they cut them all down.
One last question. Anybody?
Right here?
What's next?
Well, the interesting thing is, so let me, I'm going to show you this. I kind of glossed over him because we didn't have. The guy on the right in this photograph his name is Buck Dant. Buck owned half of Burnt Corn Bumble. And he's an interesting guy and a great steward of the land. And his interest was in conservation. And when we met, he said, look, I'm not that into archaeology. I'm sure you're a nice guy. Fine. My goal here is to preserve this landscape that's being slowly chewed up by little ranchettes out there on the edge of Santa Fe. He said, if you help me do that, I'm all for it. I'm all for it, but you should know that that's my goal. So when we concocted this project, Buck and I and the Bureau of Land Management Archaeologists on the other half of the site spent a lot of time thinking about what was the appropriate level of impact here. And Buck made it pretty clear that when we were done, he wanted to be done. He didn't want us coming back. Now, because after a while, we got to be really good friends, right? And it wasn't personal. He's just saying that you're walking up and down, you're trampling all the cryptogamic soils here, you're killing the grass, you're doing this, you're a nuisance. Human beings are wrecking the landscape here, so do your work and get out. Thank you very much. So when we wrap this up, we really wrapped it up. Now, that's not to say that there's not a lot more to learn from this landscape. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. It's probably not going to be me. Literally, what I would do if I had 2 weeks, and if I had some you want to bring some students out there for a couple of weeks, I'd go back into that doggone Cholla house and find some better wood. Because there was wood there, and if we can nail that down and say these two things burned at roughly the same time, that would be dramatic. That would be dramatic. I'll out myself on this. We were careless about that. We were careless about that. We had some samples, we got fine, lots of wood, got fine samples, fine. Not so fine, right? If we'd been a little more systematic, a little less complacent about how well it was going to date, then, we'd solved it. So that's where it is. But on another level, what's next for me, shall I say? Just to put this in context. I got a little worn down by death and destruction here. And it can be a challenge as an archaeologist, and we just happen all of us on this opportunity, to be spending a lot of time focusing on what was a horrible catastrophe for some people a long time in the past. So one of the things that our goals was to give them a little bit of a voice in our own translational way, try to tell that story as much as we could. But once we had done that, as a human being, I was prepared to leave this story as it was. Not that you couldn't do more, but probably not more. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for coming.